This is the second of 5 confrontational pericopes or episodes. Remember that Bible word pericope means a section, a story, like a parable, a miracle story, whatever. This pericope is the second of 5 confrontational pericopes in Matthew, things in which Jesus is pitted against other people as he moves towards ultimately his crucifixion and resurrection, his paschal mystery. So this is the second of 5. In fact, Matthew copied Mark's pericope pretty closely with very, very few changes. Okay, so you'll notice how I have little separations in here, and there's a point to all this. Just like, I'll just remind you that in last week's gospel of the wedding banquet and the guest who didn't have a wedding garment on, that there were 2 ways to be unworthy of being at the wedding feast. One was to refuse the invitation. No thanks, which everybody in the first round did. But the second way is not to be in the wedding garment. I'm putting that in quotes because what it means is not to appear with the conversion of heart or the behavior which goes along with someone who is baptized. So there's 2, that's what was happening in last week's. Well, there's going to be a similar, there's definite points coming out of this. So let's go to this first, I'll call it a paragraph, like a stanza. In the first one, at the beginning there, I underlined Pharisees and Herodians. So far, Jesus has been batting back and forth verbally with the chief priests and the elders. This is a significant change. This is the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, the Herodians were Jewish people who accepted the authority of Rome. And Rome placed Herod as the governor of where they lived. And so the Herodians were Jews who accepted Herod, thereby accepting Rome's power to appoint someone to govern them. Now, generally, the Pharisees and the Herodians were not partners at all. They avoided each other. But there's a lot of really strong words in this. And the first one I highlighted, entrap. This is a setup. And there is nothing subtle about this. They want to catch Jesus. And so it's so important to them that the Pharisees are willing to ally themselves to the Herodians in order to get Jesus, when unless this were happening, they wouldn't even connect with each other. They wouldn't. So this is definitely a setup. Okay, now maybe I could go through it first and then come back. So I highlighted this whole section, which is like really, obsequious. You know what that means? It's like really a suck up kind of a thing to do. It's sleazy. So if you can even picture the tone of their voice when they say what I highlighted here, teacher, they're giving him a title. Teacher, rabbi, right? Rabbi, teacher. Teacher, we know that you are a truthful man and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. And you are not concerned with anyone's opinion, for you do not regard a person's status. Now, that last line of what I highlighted there, that could actually be turned immediately around 180 degrees and jab the Pharisees, because status was important in how the Pharisees observed the 613 laws of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. You did not associate with certain people. In fact, some were untouchable, much like the pariahs in India's caste system. Now, the whole last week's whole wedding banquet thing, and when everybody refused to come after the first invitation and they went to the town square to kind of just see who else would be invited, and that would determine if they would go. That was ultimately because of the last line I highlighted. They wanted to know if the people on the who's who list were going, and then they would decide to go based on that. So this is very odd, because this whole thing is a setup. This is very odd that the Pharisees would even say something like that, which Jesus could immediately turn back to them. On Jesus' side, he ignored status as being something that was completely corrupted by the people who obeyed the laws that were given by God to them. It was never the intention of Yahweh to segregate and to divide. It was the Jewish hierarchy that legalized and codified things so that people were separated from one another, but then also in the hierarchy. So some people were up higher and some were down low. So not only were there different groups that didn't associate, there was a ranking that they presumed was moral. Some were better, some were not. People that clearly observed visibly, who observed the laws, who wore the phylacteries on their foreheads and arms, who walked around in their prayer shawls on public corners, rocking back and forth and saying their prayers. Those were visibly people who observed the laws. And what Jesus is ignoring that for is because he's saying you took the intention of what this law, what this code of Moses was, and you corrupted it to suit yourself. So Jesus, yes, ignored it. He touched anybody he wanted to. He ate with anybody he wanted to, deliberately. I said this to you before. There are some theologians that believe Jesus ended up being tried and crucified because of his eating habits. And what I mean by that is the people with whom he ate, completely ignoring this status question. So that's kind of a double entendre thing there, that last thing. So they're setting him up. And like I said before, they're being, you know what I mean when I say cloying? It's so sweet, the words that they're saying. And probably, probably even the tone of their voice indicates that as well. Okay, so next section. And this is important. After that, he says, they say to him, is it lawful? Look at what I underlined. They're forcing Jesus to take a position. And they're expecting Jesus to take the position of the zealots, who are a subgroup of the Pharisees, who want to stage a rebellion and knock out the Romans from their country. They're willing to take on the whole Roman Empire now to get Rome out of their country and make it their own land again. Those are the zealots. They're militaristic. And the people who ask this question expect Jesus to adopt the zealot position. Okay, now, next section. So the setup is like either you can only go one way or the other, according to their mind, how they're going to set up. Jesus doesn't accept the either or. He doesn't. Okay, so look at these words, look at these words. Look at the first line of that paragraph. Malice. Look at the last word and the word at the end of the last line. Hypocrites. So these are very, very, very strong words. Entrap at the beginning. Malice, hypocrites. This is strong. As I said before, this is not subtle. That's why the language isn't subtle. The language is pow, pow, pow. That's what it's meant to be. So he says, show me the coin. Okay, now you need to know this. Pharisees were unlike the Herodians, who accepted having Rome control them. I didn't say they liked it, but I said they accepted it. And part of accepting it meant that you paid the tax. But for the Pharisees, it was considered sacrilegious of them to even hold the census coin, because on the census coin was an image of the emperor And the Pharisees believed that that was, even holding it would be acknowledging that he was divine, because the emperor claimed divinity. Okay, so because they had to, the Pharisees would have to pay the tax, but do you know how they got around this idolatry thing? They had somebody else pick up the coin and deposit the tax. That's how, well, it ends up being how hypocritical they were, but that's how they believed a true believer in Yahweh would never even touch a coin with the image of someone who claimed to be God on it. Okay, so Jesus says, show me the coin. And this would make a great movie if you understood it all, because they handed him the Roman coin. Now, don't you see, they condemn themselves by having the coin on their person. Because you shouldn't, according to the Pharisees, even have such a thing in your possession. So they considered it idolatry. Okay, so they take it and give it to Jesus, and they had it with them. I mean, the irony of this is wonderful. If everybody was thinking straight and they handed him the coin, they should have made a collective, uh-oh, you know, that's the power of this. Okay, next paragraph. And they say, well, all right, who's on that? They tell him. And then he says the last part of this gospel. Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, to God what belongs to God. This whole gospel is called, by biblical scholars, a pronouncement story. There's a setup, an action, and a pronouncement, the pow. And the whole story is meant to be at the service of the punchline. And what I highlighted at the bottom of the screen now, that's the punchline. So this is a pronouncement story. That's the pronouncement. Okay, so what does Jesus do? He rejects the position of in other words, remember when they wanted to set him up? Is it lawful? They're forcing him either or. Okay, then repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. This is interesting. He rejected the position of the Zealots, but did not accept the position of the Herodians. He rejected the position of the Zealots. If he did that, he would have said, throw that coin down. We should not be paying this census tax because we cannot acknowledge that anybody has authority over us when we are God's people. That's what a zealot would say. In around World War II time, that group of Jewish people in America would be called Zionists. They want the establishment of their own land. Okay, so he rejected that, nor does he accept the Herodians. All he does is say, he's not saying what's right. He's just saying what's the fact. And the fact is, Caesar is the emperor. His image is on the coin. Our country is one of all the countries on the Mediterranean that belong to the empire now. It's just a fact. It's not right, but it's a fact. So he's not accepting the same way the Herodians are, but nor is he being a zealot, the Pharisees that want to overthrow Caesar and the whole Roman Empire to get their land back. So do you see what's happening? Jesus kind of raises the question to a whole new level. They expected him to go one way or the other. Is it lawful? Is it not lawful? He would have gotten in trouble with either answer. If it's lawful, then the Pharisees would say, what kind of a Jew are you? If he said it's not lawful, they could have run right to Pontius Pilate and said, this guy is guilty of sedition. He avoided that by just saying what he said. So he raised the whole problem to a new level. Besides, remember this. He doesn't say this, but remember this. What belongs to God are the good deeds that we need to live in and with and out of. That's how we repay God. So in fact, he's kind of slapping upside the head for both of those groups. He's saying, be what you are. And this really doesn't have anything to do with that. It's a false dichotomy, this God and government. It's a false dichotomy. What Jesus is really doing here is leaving it up to everyone's personal decision. Now, having said that, there's a couple things then that we need to look at. And this is the parallel with the first reading. Interestingly enough, Cyrus, who is not Jewish, cooperated with God more than the Herodians and the Pharisees, who were Jewish. So Cyrus actually in the beginning acted more like an instrument of God. An odd but interesting thing. And Jesus is not dodging the question. He's in fact confronting it. Now, see if this makes sense to you. All creation is God's. All creation is God's. I'm going to see if you can follow this coming down, because it's really the heart of what this gospel pericope is. All creation, because God is the creator, all creation is under God, especially people who, because they image God, have a special role in stewarding creation, the rest of creation, because we are the ones made in God's image. Okay, I'll go back to the beginning again. God as creator is the sovereign of all creation. People are the highest of all creation because we image God. That means within that context, we steward all the rest of creation because we're the ones that image God. Okay, because that's true, then we can settle all these smaller questions of how do we relate to government in the context of our being the highest of all creation because we image God. So we've got a three-part thing unfolding here. God as creator is the sovereign of all creation. People are the highest of all creation because we have the image of God. Therefore, we have the role of stewarding all the rest of creation. Stewarding, not oppressing, stewarding, caring about and for the rest of creation. And therefore, these smaller questions, like in this case, paying Caesar the census tax, they get worked out in the context of the bigger thing. As long as we fulfill our roles as bearing God's image in the world, as long as we fulfill our role of bearing God's image in the world, that's important, that's why I repeated it, then that is repaying God what belongs to God. In other words, it's our life that is the coin of the realm. The real census tax is our generosity, our service, our imaging God. The state does have a claim on us because of we live here. We could project this into 2020 and say, well, we all need and use all the infrastructure that government helps keep up, supposedly, you know, like the roads and the sidewalks and the highways and the sewer system and the water and the electric, all that, you know, we use it. And so the state does have some claim on us because we use it, but it's God that has the claim on everything. And this is really important that you understand what the coin of the realm really is. That's the metaphor. The coin of the realm is how we live up to imaging God. You know, Americans tend to see this argument as separating church and state. But in first century Palestine, that would never have been understood because everything was intertwined. You know, society and politics and religion, it was all in culture, it was all intertwined. So they would never have understood what we often, wrongly, what we often take away from this passage, the separation of church and state. Here's a way to think about this. Can God and Caesar, I'll use that as the metonymy, you know, the word that stands for all politics, can God and Caesar coexist? Well, look at it this way. What if you are created to be right now, in the middle of wherever you live, to be a channel for God's presence? What if you understood that God created you with room inside you where God is always quietly present because of love of you and love for you? That's how we belong to God, because of that truth. Now, goodness and truth, living out of who we really are, can lead to goodness in the political realm too. But remember what the real coin of the kingdom is. It's the kind of the kind of living that bears the image of God. That's the real coin of the realm. And that is really how we can give to God what belongs to God, which would automatically take care of giving to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Because if we're good and honest and just and proper in how we create this communion we belong to, that's going to make political society better too. And actually far less politicized, because it'll be more merged, it'll be more the communion that it should be, because as stewards of creation, politics is part of what we should steward. It's not just taking care of creation and taking care of each other in our family and among our neighbors and all of that. That's part of it. But politics belongs to what we should steward as well. That's why it's so important for Catholics to think critically, to vote out of critical thinking, to examine issues and make your personal choice because you have looked at issues in the context of what I just said. What the real currency of the kingdom is. The goodness, the generosity, the service, the integrity, the justice that are the ways that we image God. So it's hugely important to look at issues and candidates and think critically and vote responsibly according to your own personal decision. But it's not good for Catholics to just be passive and because this is a contentious election not to vote. And I'm not speaking out of a sense of law. I'm speaking out of the sense of acting out of who we are as imaging God. We live in the world that politics is part of, for good or for ill. But we cannot reject our responsibility to the world that we belong to, that we're part of. Because ideally, who we are as belonging to God is going to shape the world we live in. Without having to stand on a corner and wave a flag or a banner, without having to walk down the middle aisle of the subway and say, "Are you saved? Are you saved?" It's not talk that's going to do it. It's action that's going to do it. That's divine activity that actually is mentioned in the second reading. God has a claim on all we have. And with that understanding, then we have a responsibility to steward everything else, these lesser important things, in the context of the bigger truth. That's the message of the gospel. We pay only one tax, the way we image Jesus Christ.